Hey everybody, what's going on? Hexlex here with another Master Duel video for y'all. So today we're going to be doing yet another tier list. This one is going to be for the post-ban list meta. So as we all know, here in a little under 2 weeks now, we're going to be having our next ban list here in Master Duel. That's got some pretty decent shakeups. It's not like a hugely impactful ban list as far as like shifting what all decks are going to be like, prevalent in the meta and their position in the meta, but it is still going to have a decent amount of impact. And it's been a little bit since we've done one of these. I usually like to do one of these about once per month towards the top of the season, just kind of share my thoughts about the meta moving forward. So before we get started, I do want to make sure that I shout out the Patreon. We actually just added a new perk recently that you're going to actually be seeing at the end of not only this video, but all future videos moving forward. Now, when you subscribe over at Patreon, you will be credited at the end of the video in the outro sequence as part of the, well, just special thanks there. So if you're looking for some extra daily Master Duel content, you can of course find that there as well. I upload there every single day, so between video previews, exclusive gameplay, Q&As, and then now of course also the recently added perk of being credited at the end of the video. There are multiple benefits to subscribing over there, in addition to of course supporting the channel as well. It is a huge help, so thank you very much to everyone who is checking that out. Alright, so without further ado, I think I'm just going to go ahead and dive straight into placing some of these decks on this tier list here. And right here at the top we have actually one of the spicier placements here. One of the more difficult ones, I think. I actually thought a lot about this. Adamancipator. So Adamancipator's in a pretty interesting spot right now, for multiple reasons. Adamancipator, saw a huge resurgence in the Anti-Spell Festival back in Season 11 in, mid-November. And I think that was really what kind of clued people into thinking, like, hey, this deck isn't really dead like we all thought it was. And this is something that I've touched on a lot in the series before, or not series, on the channel just in general before. And I've gotten questions by saying, when you talk about tier lists, you talk about usage versus power level. Shouldn't decks only be ranked by power level? The answer is actually no. In a vacuum, in a quote-unquote perfect meta where people were playing decks solely based on power level and for no other reason, then yes, we could just evaluate decks on their power level. But that's not how decks are played. That's not how people play decks. Decks kind of go in and out of fashion, in and out of style. New packs come out, new cards come out, people will always gravitate towards the new and move away from the old. And even if new, consistently meta decks aren't coming out, even if we have a string of time where new releases aren't really impacting the meta, then that's still going to mean that people are going to move away from decks that have been used a lot in the past. And that was the case with Adamancipator, right? We saw Adamancipator being used fairly prominently towards the start of Master Duel, pretty much up until Sword Souls came out. And, it wasn't because Adamancipators took any significant hits. Black Dragon 1 is the first time the deck has actually taken a very significant hit. And unless you want to count the banning of Halki Fibrax, which you could also go back and forth about that. But in any case, the deck, honestly, even when it lost Halki Fibrax, along with, Sword Soul Tenyi and all those other decks, it's still, that wasn't really what killed it. It was really when Sword Soul Tenyis came out around Season 5. We had, our first ban list and all that huge meta shift. That was when people kind of dropped Adamancipator, even though the only hit Adamancipator took during that time was Roxy's to 2, which is pretty much a non-hit. So, I think the deck has always been viable. It's certainly always been viable. I don't even just think that. I know it's always been viable, but only after it got a resurgence in popularity is it now being played, and now Black Dragon is finally being addressed. So that's my long way of saying, you could really make an argument for putting Adamancipator, honestly, in any of these three spots. Even after Black Dragon has gone to 1, I think Adamancipator is still a tier 3 deck, and I expect it'll probably see tier 3 representation moving forward. I don't think it'll be the upper echelon of tier 3. It'll probably be mid to lower. It'll honestly probably end up in upper rogue if I really had to guess, but this is a bit more of a compromise in terms of I think in terms of representation, Adamancipator will end up in upper rogue, but I think if you factor in its actual power, again, even with Black Dragon going to 1, I think the deck is still a very solid tier 3 deck. And really, it's always been somewhere in this neighborhood, this whole time. It's again really just it really shows that representation can very, very much impact a deck's placement into meta, much more so than its own inherent power level. Alright, speaking of spicy picks, we've got Branded Despia is going to be the next deck that we're going to place here. This one, Alibur went to 2, so the deck loses only 1 copy of Alibur. I think we're kind of all in agreement that doesn't really affect too much. The deck is still going to be the top tier 1 deck moving forward, in my opinion. There are a couple of different options as far as like making up for that lack of consistency. If you weren't playing Foolish Burial before, you certainly do now in order to send the Despian Tragedy. I've also seen people talk about playing Gold Sarcophagus to banish the Despian Tragedy from deck to add the Alibur. Another potential add you could do is the Springand's Kit, which will be able to add Branded Fusion. Do note though that if you use Springand's Kit, you do have to put a card back, so it is like, you know, you're losing a lot of advantage by doing that. I am going to go for, I think, a little bit of a different route that we'll see moving forward once I cover my post-banlist build for Branded Despia. But ultimately, as far as the deck's placement in the meta, I really don't think it changes at all. It's still definitely going to be the top tier 1 deck. Alibur to 2 is a slight consistency hit, but not one that I think is going to ultimately be like a death knell for the deck or anything like that. Okay, so next, represented by Aqua Argonaut, we have Marincess. This deck has been showing up very consistently since it's, well, not released, but since it got a huge boost in the Cosmic Ocean pack. We were definitely still seeing the impact of this deck on the format even long after that pack has been released. So it's definitely not just a fad with this deck or like a phase or anything. Marincess is definitely here to stay. And I think it's still a pretty solid like tier 3 option. I think it's been pretty consistently in like lower tier 3 for honestly since Cosmic Ocean came out. You could even make an argument that at some point before it was like up to tier 2, but I still think it's a very solid tier 3 deck. I do think Adamancipator is a little bit better. Adamancipator definitely is a little bit more, I don't know if it's necessarily more or less resilient to combo disruption than to Marincess, but all in all, it has more options as far as like end boards go. And I do think its end board is more powerful, so I think Adamancipators are still slightly better here. Alright, coming up next we have Soul Tenyi. This deck, I mean, I always bring it up, or at least lately I always bring it up whenever I talk about this deck. It's kind of funny how this deck has like not changed at all, but is still exactly as good as it's always been. Definitely it's definitely, I think, the most well-designed archetype in the last, in very recent Yu-Gi-Oh! Is Sword Souls. It's like, it's very strong and very consistently strong, but not overbearingly so, or be like, it's not really overpowered in any way, shape, or form, honestly. I think the most unfair card in the deck is probably Archnemesis Protos, and you could make an argument for potentially hitting that card, but I think even leaving that card at 1, well, I mean, it'd be a 3 or 0 kind of a thing, because the deck only plays 1, but I honestly think the card is fine, and I don't think it pushes Soul Tenyi as a whole into anything too absurd or anything like that. So Soul Tenyi very much still a tier 1 deck alongside Branded Despia, as in my opinion it has been this entire time, and until it gets power crept out of the format, I think it'll remain up here. I don't think it deserves any hits, honestly, like I said, because it's just so, it's fair. Like, in all the years I've played Yu-Gi-Oh!, I feel like Sword Soul is honestly one of the most powerful but fair archetypes I've ever played with or against, honestly, so. Alright. Next up we have Drytron. So Drytron, sorry, one sec. Pardon me, I'm still recovering from my little bout of COVID there. So Drytron saw a bit of a resurgence in the last month or so, particularly during the Duelist Cup. I noticed in both our analysis of it and also personally playing in the Duelist Cup, I saw a bit more Drytron than I have, on ladder. So I don't know if that's just because of the competitive nature of Duelist Cup. Maybe some people just want to use the Herald of Perfection / Ultimateness to lock out the game and do so that way. But honestly, I think Drytron is still a rogue deck. I don't think its resurgence necessarily is an indication of anything as far as it being like better positioned in the meta. I don't think it's a bad deck. And I even remember when Ben 10 went to 1 and the deck fell off entirely. I was like, well, I think the deck is still viable. Like, it's definitely still at least a rogue deck. But yeah, it definitely was one of those decks that just fell off completely with representation, much like Adamancipator did, actually, as soon as, like, the meta shifted significantly, / it got hit a little bit. So, well, to be fair, Ben 10 to 1 is more of a hit than Adamancipator stuck with Roxy's to 2, much more of a hit, but the deck, you know, definitely still a very solid rogue deck there. Floowandereeze, speaking of decks that people thought were dead but are still seeing play, this one much more so than Drytron. Floowandereeze still making a very large impact in the meta, enough that I didn't really talk about this during my actual, you know, video where we discussed the ban list, but I think the semi-limiting of Pot of Duality had as much to do with Floowandereeze as it did Runick's, maybe even a little bit more, honestly. You know, this deck recently saw a pretty significant hit with the Wind Barrier statue going to 1, the Barrier statue of the Storm Winds, or not to 1, to 0 rather, but that still does not stop Floowandereeze from being an excellent disruption deck. Even if it loses its more like floodgatey options, the deck is still very much capable of shutting out a lot of decks in this format. I still think it's a tier 2 deck. Like, I know before when the Wind statue got banned, I thought, you know, I'd put it back down to like, you know, upper tier 3, but I think it's a tier 2 deck, honestly, at this point, and the results from the Duelist Cup have definitely proven that. The semi-limiting of Pot of Duality definitely does not, you know, change that fact either. It's a very small consistency hit, much like the Aliber going to 2. And once we move forward into tier limits and, you know, decks that can use Dimension Shifter and other banishing tools become a lot more prevalent, then I think we'll see Floowandereeze continue to be standing strong here in tier 2. Alright, next up we have Endymion, another deck that's actually been seeing a fairly decent resurgence of popularity. It was very popular around the first Duelist Cup and then kind of like waned after that. Then when the, what is it, something Tactics, the pack with Beyond the Pendulum, when Beyond the Pendulum came out, that definitely caused Endymion and Pendulum decks in general to get a bit of a resurgence of popularity. Endymion has been pretty consistently played and, not just played, but good. Honestly, since the release of Beyond the Pendulum, it's been fairly consistently showing up in our looks at Diamond decks and Duelist Cup decks. So, Endymion, I think, is tier 3. I honestly put it around the same ballpark as Marincess, where, you know, it was a deck that I thought was very much rogue, and then I got a new bit of support and it saw more play, and I was like, well, we'll see if this actually like pans out, if it's just like a popularity bump, or if this is actually like a consistent power boost to the deck. And I think much like Marincess, the boost from Beyond the Pendulum, from what I understand, you know, maybe I could be wrong about that, and Endymion doesn't actually play Beyond the Pendulum, or it doesn't use it all the time, or it's not that significant. I don't actually play Endymion, but I'm pretty sure I've seen Beyond the Pendulum in Endymion lists, and for that reason, I think that's why it's still being pretty consistently played and showing some good results there. Alright, next up we have Orcust. Orcust recently got a boost, not on this ban list that's about to come out, of course, but the last one with Galatea to 2. And following that, we did see Orcust have a good showing in the Duelist Cup as well. Galatea is one of those, Galatea to 2 in particular is one of those, you know, semi-limits that really helps a more rogue archetype kind of see more play and more consistency as well. I think Orcust are definitely still a rogue deck, but I think I would put them above Drytron. They're about the same level. And rogue decks in general, you know, just because it's not tier 1, 2, or 3, I don't think that means it's like a bad deck or anything. I think quite the opposite, actually. Rogue decks are definitely still very, very good. And beyond just being good, I think a rogue deck is more than capable of hitting Diamond within a season, and with a dedicated / skilled enough pilot, I think it could definitely even reach Diamond 1. So all the decks you're seeing here are viable for competitive ladder. Just because I put a deck down in rogue does not mean I think it's like a bad deck or anything. Orcust, I think, are actually a pretty interesting deck, and I'd be interested to learn a little bit more about them, especially if they're going to keep getting tools like Galatea slowly coming off the list there. Alright, next we have Runick's, everyone's favorite question mark deck. No. Runick's have definitely been very popular, let's say that. Between people playing them and discussing them, Runick's have made quite an impact on the meta, much more so than I thought they were going to. I thought Runick's would be kind of used more as an engine, and even then, like, a little bit later down the line when other cards get released, but it does seem to have an immediate and noticeable impact on the Master Duel metagame. I don't think I'm alone in thinking that Runick's are a very solid tier 2 deck. I don't think they're tier 1 by any means. I think Branded Despia and Soul Tenyi are definitely, like, overall going to be better decks. I think the fact that the floodgates are such a prominent part of Runick is, I mean, that's obviously why people kind of dislike them, why they're an unpopular deck choice to some people. But I also think that at the same time that is fueling why Runicks are seeing so much play as well. Like, I don't know, if I'm, looking to rank up and I have all these Runick cards and I see people in the subreddit talking about conceding the second they see a Runick card, why not jam Runicks, So I think that Runicks moving forward are going to be used more, again, as an engine as opposed to a standalone deck as future support comes out. But for the time being, we're seeing pure Runick having a very good showing in Master Duel, much to some people's dismay. As far as what I think of Runicks personally, and this actually is true of Floodgate decks, period, I think they're fine. Like, to a degree, like, yes, we do need to make sure, especially in a best of one format, that we are regulating the number of floodgates that are available in the card pool. And I do think there can only be one, could go to two, or even one, either way. Probably two would be fine if Skill Drain and, what's the other one that's used a lot? Rivalry and Gozen are at two. But I think as far as, like, stun decks being, existing, period, like, I don't think all floodgates need to be banned or anything like that. I think floodgates provide a healthy check to the meta, where there's this kind of dichotomy between comboing and, strategies that prevent comboing. If we take out all the floodgates, if we take out everything that prevents players from comboing, then we just have people complaining endlessly about comboing. Like, trying to hit decks in order to keep, people complacent or keep people from complaining is just frankly never going to happen. And similarly, like, hitting decks to try to make sure there's no one meta deck is also never going to happen. Within any card pool, there is always going to be like one or two or three or four, just some amount of best decks. There are always going to be decks that are better than others. So I don't think the goal of a ban list should be to like prevent a meta from happening, because that's not feasible, viable, or frankly even possible. I think it should be to promote the healthiest meta possible. And despite what a lot of people would say with Runicks being as prominent as they are, I think we're in an extremely healthy meta right now. But that could honestly be its own video. That could be its own whole talking point. So I digress for the time being. Next up we have Labrynth. Labrynth being another new archetype that has made a decent impact here on the metagame. I think as far as like representation, particularly in the Duelist Cup, we saw it as more of like a tier 3 deck. But moving forward, now that the hype for it has kind of like died down a bit, until it gets more support, I think it's going to be more in the rogue category. I do think it is above, if I could get this out of the way, there we go. I do think it's above like Orcust and Drytron. I definitely think Labrynth is more of like an upper rogue deck, but I do think it is still a rogue deck. Again, until it gets newer support. When newer support comes out, then we definitely see Labrynth. It's going to depend on what the rest of the meta looks like, but I think we'll definitely start to see Labrynth at that point bust into some of these upper tiers here. Alrighty, the next deck that we're going to be talking about here is Sky Striker. So Sky Striker, I think as far as like individual impact on one deck, not the meta as a whole, but one deck goes, Sky Striker is the biggest winner from this ban list. Kagiri going to 2 is huge for this deck. It's a massive upgrade. It lets the deck play grind games a lot more easily, which obviously being a control deck, Sky Striker typically wants to be doing anyway. It also allows you to free up some potential main deck space if, maybe you were playing some cards that were used mostly to recycle the Kagiri. I'm thinking particularly, I don't remember the name, the Sky Striker equip spell. You don't have to run that card anymore. I will say Pot of Avarice is probably still good in the deck. I think Pot of Avarice has always been one of those, like, you could play 1, maybe 2, or you could play 0. I definitely don't think you play 2 anymore, but I still think 1 Pot of Avarice is fine, and I think I'll probably actually end up with a single Pot of Avarice in my build. We'll see. I'm still tweaking my Sky Striker build for the format moving forward, but I definitely look forward to trying out Sky Striker with 2 Kagiri, and also future support that's coming out as well, particularly the Sky Striker spell Linkage, which will allow them to have more easily accessible OTK options, especially with Kagiri being at 2. So yeah, Sky Striker, I would definitely keep my eye on this deck. It's going to get more powerful as it gets more support, and I think it's already pretty decent. It's been pretty firmly rogue for most of its entirety of, or most of its time here in Master Duel. And I know I said this when Widow Anchor went to 3, but this time I really do think Sky Striker is going to finally break out of Rogue and be a consistently tier 3 deck. I don't know that it'll be above Marincess, or even above Endymion. I'll put it in the middle because I think it's about on par with these decks after the ban list. Now, that said, it will really depend on representation for Sky Striker. It's really weird, right? Sky Striker is one of those decks that kind of like seems to go in and out of popularity, even, you know, as stuff kind of doesn't really change too much about the deck. But, yeah, I think the boost with Kagiri will not only provide a power boost, but also a representation boost, enough to see it firmly here in Tier 3. And again, also with the spell linkage coming out, that'll also be, or not that it is going to come out soon, but when it comes out, that'll provide yet another needed power boost for the deck there. Alright, next deck we're going to talk about is Dinomorphias. This is another deck that got a recent bit of a power boost in the form of added support. Dinomorphias recently got Rexturm, which kind of acts as a skill drain on legs for the deck, locking your opponent out of monster effects as long as it's in play. Dinomorphias didn't, I mean, they saw a decent bit of play before Rexturm, but they've definitely been seeing a lot more play, since Rexturm came out there. I think I'm going to put Rexturm and, well, not Rexturm, just Dinomorphias as a whole in the rogue category. I think it's about on par with where Labrynth is right now. You could really make an argument for, like, you know, either of these being above the other, but much like Labrynth, Dinomorphia is just going to sit, you know, it's an upper rogue deck, to be fair. I don't know if it's actually better than Orcust. I don't really have experience with the other deck, but to be fair, these are all like generally at about the same power level anyway. So Rexturm, yes, it is a huge boost for Dinomorphia. I don't think it's enough to cause Dinomorphia to break out of Rogue, though. I think in terms of representation, it's seeing like Tier 3 representation at the time being, but the power level and representation over time, I think, will fall back down to the Rogue category. Alright, just a few more decks to wrap up with here, one of those being Dragon Link. Dragon Link is one of those decks where, like, I tend to think it's more powerful than it's actually, than the representation would indicate. But that makes sense for Dragon Link, because Dragon Link is definitely not an easy deck to get into, as far as just, like, learning how it plays and trying to figure out all the combo lines. It definitely took me a long time, much longer than other decks I've played, to really finally fully feel comfortable. I don't even know if I always fully feel comfortable with Dragon Link, because also because there's so many steps, right, with Dragon Link, that I always feel like I'm going to mess one of them up. But as far as like at least knowing what I'm doing, I do feel generally pretty comfortable with Dragon Link. I think the deck is a Tier 3 deck, and I think it's probably going to be upper Tier 3. Well, I think, honestly, it's a Tier 2 deck. I think it should be about here, but as far as like where the representation is going to put it, I think it'll be more closer to here in upper Tier 3, as opposed to lower Tier 2. Alright, here we have Salamangreats. It's represented by Sunlight Wolf. Salamangreats are a very solid contender, I think, just generally speaking, because they have the structure deck that's very accessible, and then once you get 3 copies of that, all you need are staples, and then you've got a competitive deck. So I think for that reason mainly, we'll see Salamangreats continue to crop up in tier lists moving forward. I do think that the hype kind of from that structure deck being released is now more or less fully died down. During that time, Salamangreats saw enough play to be considered as a tier 3 deck. I think now they're a pretty firmly rogue deck, but I also think they're like on the upper echelon of rogue. I would put them at the top of this rogue list right here, among all these other decks. It's very, very close, I think, whether Salamangreat hits tier 3 or not, but ultimately I do think it is, while again at the top of rogue, it's still a rogue deck. One last deck that we're going to be talking about here, and that's Madolches. Madolches are, it's funny, I haven't really played with the deck much at all. It's not, especially not since, coming back to Master Duel. But even before then, the TCG, I didn't really play them that much. I don't really encounter them that much on ladder, myself, personally, but I always see them crop up in, and not just like tournament tier lists, but when we're looking at Diamond and Duelist Cup decks, we always see a healthy amount of Madolches. It's a very solid rogue deck, and it has been for quite some time. I think it's a step probably below Salamangreats, but only just so. It's probably actually about on par with Salamangreats, and I think a half a step above even some of these other rogue decks. Again, even if I don't personally see Madolches that often, and maybe you don't either, I don't know, but I still think that it's a very, very solid rogue deck all the same. So there it is. There is the tier list. This is my post-ban list tier list for the Master Duel meta of Season 13. It's generally, pretty close to the same as what we've been seeing. like I mentioned at the top of the video, I don't think the deck necessarily, or the format rather, not the deck, the format is going to be hugely shaken up by this list, but I do think it will get healthier as a result, and we do still see on an individual deck-to-deck basis some pretty significant shakeups, like I said, mainly for Sky Striker there, but also for Adamancipator, definitely. Losing those 2 Block Dragon definitely impacts how Adamancipator plays quite a bit there. Alright, that is going to do it once again for the tier list here. Now let's move to the outro. Alright everybody, thank you so much for watching all the way to the very end of the video like this. That means a whole lot to me. Not just personally, but it's also a great way of supporting the channel as well. If you're interested in supporting the channel in other means, you can of course feel free to comment and or subscribe right here on YouTube. I'm always looking to the comments section. You guys leave some pretty awesome feedback as far as like constructive criticism goes when it comes to deck building, gameplay, channel content, all that stuff. So feel free to leave your opinion down there. I will be sure to take a look at that there. And then subscribing is going to be the best way to get notifications of when these videos drop. That does happen every day, by the way, so if you're looking for daily Master Duel content, you've come to the right place. And there are more places where you can get some daily Master Duel content. If you check out the description below, follow the top link over to my Patreon page. There for just $5 a month, which is as much as you pay for a booster pack. You'll find a lot more value than a pack full of filler over there. We've got some previews for content upcoming here on the channel. We've got some exclusive games that are only posted over on Patreon over there. We've got some Q&As, and then you can also have your name featured in this lovely credit sequence where I thank all of the people who are helping contribute over there on Patreon. It's a huge support to the channel, and it really means a lot as well. So thank you everyone who is donating that is featured here on screen. And again, you know, it's not just a pure donation, you do get some more daily Master Duel content over there just for being a part of the Patreon. But I think that's about all the time that I have for today's video. Once again, I just want to thank you so very much for sticking all the way to the end of the video. Again, it just means a lot as I do put a decent amount of work into getting these videos out every single day. But that's about all the time that I've got for now, so without further ado, this is Xlex. I'm signing out, and I hope you have a fantastic day.